Hi everybody. In this lesson we're going to talk through the third of the nutrient cycles, those biogeochemical cycles, and this is going to be my nitrogen cycle. All right, so when we look at nitrogen, nitrogen is really important for living things. It is one of the most important components that helps to make up our DNA. It's one of the most important components of proteins, and proteins are really like the doers of the cell. They do all the important things in the cell, and they're an extremely important component of ATP, which is the molecule that works as cellular energy. So energy that actually powers specific functions in the cell. So nitrogen is super important for living things. A lot of the nitrogen that we see on Earth, and really predominantly the most nitrogen we see on Earth, we find in the atmosphere. So 78% of our atmosphere comes as just pure nitrogen, or N2. Unfortunately, this N2 is not usable. So it's unusable by most plants and animals. Plants and animals can't just use straight up N2. And the reason for that is because of the way that these nitrogen atoms are bonded together to form this N2 molecule. So nitrogen, when it bonds to a second nitrogen, actually forms a triple bond between these atoms. So this triple bond is super strong, and it makes it very difficult for plant and animal cells to come in and break those bonds. Makes it really hard to just like break these guys apart and then just use this single nitrogen atom. So because of that triple bond, N2 isn't really usable. So plants and animals need ways to kind of unlock, so to speak, unlock this nitrogen so that it can be used. And that's really what this nitrogen cycle revolves around. So really the unlocking of that N2 so it can be used by plants and animals. So these are the other different forms that nitrogen can take throughout the nitrogen cycle. So we have our atmospheric nitrogen. So this is my N2. So this is nitrogen as gas hanging out in the atmosphere. The second one here, this NH3. So this is a single nitrogen atom bonded with 3 atoms of hydrogen. This is ammonia. Ammonia is usable by some plants, but it's still, it basically takes nitrogen and it removes it from the atmosphere when it forms this ammonia, and ammonia is typically going to be a liquid. So this is kind of a different form. And then we also see this NO2 minus and this NO3 minus. These two kind of get glommed together a lot. And these are the nitrates and the nitrites. It's okay if you guys don't really know the difference between the 8s and the ites. That's totally fine. But as long as you can recognize that NO2 minus and NO3 minus, that these are different forms of nitrogen that we find through the nitrogen cycle, that's totally fine. All right, so now let's start. We're going to go ahead and start by looking at nitrogen gas in the atmosphere. This is going to be our starting place. So we have nitrogen gas just floating around in the atmosphere. And one of the processes, or really the process that takes nitrogen out of the atmosphere, we call it nitrogen fixation. So this is when we take N2 from the atmosphere and convert it into this NH3, which is that ammonia. So here we're converting nitrogen into a usable form for some plants. Some plants can just straight up use ammonia. So think about some different types of fertilizers. One of the components of a lot of different types of fertilizers is that NH3 ammonia that plants can use. Different things are going to do this. So there are some bacteria that can convert this N2 into ammonia. And typically these bacteria, they're going to be associated with the roots of plants. They're actually going to live alongside the roots of plants. And this happens specifically in legumes. A legume, these are like our beans that are in pods. Peanuts are technically a legume. So think like beans that are in pods. So like green beans and I'm losing my brain. I can't think of any others. But we also have lightning. So lightning can also fix this nitrogen and actually cause it to bond and form this ammonia as well. So that seems kind of weird, but lightning can also do some nitrogen fixing, which I think is pretty cool. So here, nitrogen fixation. This happens primarily through the processes with nitrogen fixing bacteria, and it's going to form this NH3, or convert my N2 gas into this NH3. So here's my nitrogen now as NH3. So that's really the step that takes nitrogen out of the atmosphere, and we call that nitrogen fixation. Okay, then we have this other process called nitrification. So nitrification is when we have this NH3 ammonia, which is usable by plants a little bit, and that use by plant we call assimilation. We can see that here. So when plants use that ammonia, it assimilates into the plant. But not very many plants can actually use straight up ammonia. So there's another process that happens, and we actually have more bacteria. Bacteria do a lot in this nitrogen cycle. We have nitrifying bacteria, and that nitrifying bacteria will actually convert this ammonia into nitrates and nitrites. So this NO2 minus and this NO3 minus. And these nitrates and nitrites, they're very usable by plants. So this is predominantly what we see in fertilizers. Fertilizers are really just adding nitrogen to the soil, specifically NO2, NO3, our nitrates and our nitrites. So here we see down below nitrification. Takes ammonia, it converts it into nitrate. Okay, you can also write nitrite in here. Nitrates and nitrites, and then that can be assimilated by plants. So then that can come up here and plants can absorb that into their roots. And then some plants can also take in that ammonia. All right, so this is a cycle. So there's a couple of different things that can happen from this plant. So if that plant dies, some other decomposers can actually come in. They can break down the nitrates and nitrites and really the components of those plants, and they can do a process called ammonification. So this is essentially turning into ammonia again. So we're going to take our nitrates and our nitrites, we're going to turn them back into that NH3, that ammonia, so we see that arrow going back to ammonia here. Okay, so this is going to happen with dead things, with feces, so our decomposers are going to be the thing doing this action. And then finally, we also need a way to cycle back and get that N2 back into the atmosphere, because this is a nitrogen cycle. We want this stuff to kind of go back. So once we have these nitrates and nitrites over here, we can also have some bacteria. So we have our nitrifying bacteria here, turning it into nitrates and nitrites. We have our denitrification, our denitrifying bacteria that actually convert it back into this N2 gas in the atmosphere. So we're going to convert these nitrates and nitrates back into N2. There's different types of things that do this. So anaerobic bacteria is a big one. So bacteria that operates with a lack of oxygen. We also see some fungi that decompose waste and dead material, and they can also denitrify. So they can turn these nitrates and nitrites back into this N2 gas. So here's that whole cycle. So if we start with our gas in the atmosphere, nitrifying, we have our nitrogen fixing bacteria. Nitrogen fixation happens, it turns it to ammonia. Then nitrification can happen, turn that ammonia into nitrates and nitrites as well. And this can be assimilated by plants. So assimilation can happen, it can be absorbed into plants. Then those plants, if they die, or let's say an animal comes and eats the plant and then the animal poops, then we have the ammonification that's happening by our decomposers. Or we can have these nitrates and nitrites being denitrified. Denitrification can happen and convert it back into that N2 gas again. So we see this cycling in a couple of different ways. Here's another image that shows this. So again, if we start with our nitrogen in the atmosphere, let's pick a different color. Our nitrogen in the atmosphere up here, that nitrogen in the atmosphere can be fixed, okay, by bacteria associated with the roots of plants and in the soil. So here nitrogen fixation happens, and that turns this into that ammonia. So there's my NH3 ammonia here. Then we can have nitrification happening. That nitrification allows plants to kind of absorb that nitrogen. So we have our nitrates and nitrites, so assimilation can happen here. We also have denitrification. So once it's nitrified, it can denitrify. So that denitrification can put it back up in the atmosphere. And then we also have kind of dead things and urine and feces and other waste. Decomposers are acting on those, and we see ammonification happening, so turning this into ammonia as well. So this can be kind of a crazy like loop-de-loop. So I could come from the atmosphere, Could start in the atmosphere up here. Nitrogen can be fixed. Then it might be nitrified, absorbed by a plant. Then maybe a bunny eats the plant, and then the bunny poops. And then we see some ammonification. Then it can kind of loop around this way for a while. Or maybe, you know, the grass dies, it decomposes, ammonification happens. Then some denitrifying bacteria come in and turn it back into nitrogen in the atmosphere. So all of those things are possible. So then it could loop around this way again. So we can have a couple of different types of cycles that are going on with our nitrogen cycle. If you guys have any other questions, go ahead and leave them at the end of the video. We will pick this up on Tuesday when you guys get back to class. Do some practice, answer some questions. Let me know if you need any help.